The rattle of the train was a constant, a rhythm that had worked its way into Ruthie Caldwell's bones over the last 4 days. It was the beat of a new life, or so she prayed. Outside the grimy window, New England's dense, comforting green had long bled away, replaced by a landscape so vast and empty it threatened to swallow a person whole. Wyoming Territory. The name itself sounded like the wind that scoured the plains. A lonely, whistling sound. Red dust, fine as flour, coated the windowsill and the hem of her sturdy wool skirt. It settled in the lines of her hands, hands that were no stranger to grit. At 26, her hands already told a story of loss and labor, of bobbins and looms in a textile mill where the air was thick with lint and the noise of the machines devoured all thought. She had left that life behind with nothing but a worn, old carpetbag on her lap and a matrimonial letter tucked inside her bodice, its paper softened by countless readings. Her fingers went to it now, a reflexive gesture of reassurance. She didn't need to read the words. She knew them by heart. Miss Caldwell, it began, in a script that was plain and strong, with no wasted flourishes. My name is Elijah Kane. I am 34 years of age, a widower with 2 small children, a boy, Will, aged 6, and a girl, Clara, 4. I own a small ranch outside of Red Rock. I do not drink to excess, nor am I given to temper. I am looking for a wife, a partner. The work is hard, but the life is honest. I can promise you a home, respect, and my protection. I have enclosed funds for your passage. A home. The word was a balm on a wound she'd carried since she was a child, passed from one reluctant relative to another after her parents were taken by fever. A home wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was a place to set down her bag and know she wouldn't have to pick it up again tomorrow. It was the opposite of the clatter and the endless, anonymous motion of the train. She glanced around the carriage. A few dusty-looking men in wide-brimmed hats were playing cards, their voices a low murmur. A woman with a weathered face and kind eyes sat across the aisle, knitting something small and blue. She had introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, on her way home to Cheyenne after visiting her sister back east. "First time out west, dear Mrs.?" Gable had asked on the second day, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. Ruthie had simply nodded, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. The words mail-order bride felt like a brand she wore on her forehead. It was a practical arrangement, a desperate bargain, but she could feel the judgment of the world already pressing in. "You're headed for Red Rock," you said, the woman continued, her eyes not leaving her work. "That's cane country, in a manner of speaking. Not the big canes, mind you, not Barrett Sloane's outfit. He's got more cattle than God and a temper to match. No, you're headed for Elijah Kane's place. A good man, from what I hear, quiet. Keeps to himself since his Mary passed." She sighed, pausing her knitting. "A terrible thing. Childbirth fever. Left him with those 2 little ones. They say his hens lay blue eggs. You know, araucanas. Swears they bring good luck. Blue eggs." The detail was so peculiar, so unexpected, that it made Elijah Kane feel more real than his letter ever could. It painted a picture of a life that wasn't just about survival, but about small wonders. A man who kept strange chickens couldn't be all hard edges and sorrow. The mention of the other name, Barrett Sloane, had been less comforting. Later, she'd heard 2 men talking by the water cooler, their voices low and sharp. They spoke of Sloane as if he were a king or a storm on the horizon. "Heard he's squeezing the homesteaders again," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a cuspidor. "Wants that whole stretch along the new rail spur. Says fences are an impediment to progress." The other man grunted. "Kane's fence is right in his path. Stubborn man. Kane. Won't sell. Sloane'll find a way," the first man said with a grim certainty. "He always does." The conversation had sent a chill through Ruthie despite the oppressive heat of the carriage. She was traveling toward a man who was already in a fight, a man whose fence was considered a thorn in the side of someone powerful. Her dream of a quiet home suddenly seemed terribly fragile. Now, with the sun beginning to dip low and paint the vast sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, a gnawing unease settled in her stomach. It was more than just nerves. It was a specific, cold dread that had been growing for the past hour. She had taken out the envelope Elijah had sent, the one that had held her ticket and the travel money. It was a simple transaction on the train she'd meant to make to buy a hot cup of coffee from the steward to ward off the evening chill. She'd pulled out the $20 bill he'd included for expenses, the last of it. The steward, a man with a tired face and a stained waistcoat, had taken the bill, held it up to the fading light, and frowned. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. "Sorry, miss, can't take this." "Why not?" Ruthie had asked, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. "It's no good." He'd handed it back, his expression a mixture of pity and suspicion. A bad counterfeit. "The paper's all wrong." She took the bill back, her fingers trembling. She had stared at it, at the face of Andrew Jackson that seemed to be smirking at her. A counterfeit. The word echoed in her mind. Elijah Kane. The man who wrote of honesty and respect had sent her a fake banknote. The blood drained from her face. Every fear she had suppressed during the long journey rushed to the surface. Was this the truth of it? Was he a cheat, a swindler, luring a desperate woman out to the wilderness for reasons she couldn't bear to imagine? Perhaps he wasn't a rancher at all. Perhaps there were no children, no blue eggs, only a trap laid with false promises and fake money. The men on the train called this framing a man, making him look like a crook. But what if he was the crook? Her first instinct was to cry. Her second was to get off the train at the very next stop, find the first locomotive heading east, and never look back. She could return to the mill. The work was crushing, her existence meager, but at least it was a familiar misery. It was safe. But as she sat there, the worthless bill clutched in her hand, she thought again of Elijah's words. The work is hard, but the life is honest. The script was so straightforward, so devoid of artifice, it didn't feel like the writing of a dishonest man. And what of Mrs. Gable's words? A good man. Quiet. It didn't fit. And what if he hadn't known? The thought was a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness of her panic. What if someone else had passed the bad bill to him? What if this was connected to the powerful man? Barrett Sloan, a man who wanted his land, who saw his fence as an obstacle. What better way to cause trouble for a man like Elijah Kane than to make him look like a cheap swindler to the woman he was bringing out to marry? It was a cruel, public sort of humiliation. She looked out the window again. The landscape was darkening, the mountains in the distance now just jagged silhouettes against a bruised sky. There was nowhere to run out here. It was a place where you had to stand and face what was coming. She had run her whole life from the memory of her parents' graves, from the poverty of her relatives, from the suffocating noise of the factory. She was tired of running. She had come this far. She had staked the last of her hope on that letter. She wouldn't let a single piece of bad paper, a single flicker of fear, turn her back now. She would go to Red Rock. She would step onto that platform, look Elijah Kane in the eye, and she would know. She would see the truth in his face, or she would see the lie. Either way, she had to know for herself. Straightening her spine, Ruthie carefully folded the counterfeit bill and tucked it deep within her bodice. Separate from the letter, it was evidence, one way or another. Her fear had not vanished, but it had solidified into a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just a hopeful bride-to-be. She was a woman on her way to a confrontation. The train's whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that tore through the immense silence of the plains. It sounded like a warning, or maybe, she thought, as she clutched the worn handle of her carpet bag, it was an announcement. She was coming, and she was coming for the truth. The red dust of Wyoming was no longer just a sign of a foreign land. It was the soil of the place where she would finally, for better or for worse, make her stand. The train shuddered, groaned, and finally hissed to a stop. The sound of steam and squealing iron, a final, jarring punctuation to Ruthie's long journey through the dusty glass. She saw it Red Rock. It was less a town and more a collection of weathered buildings clinging to a single, wide dirt street, as if afraid of the immense, sun-bleached emptiness that surrounded it. A general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a livery stable, and a handful of other structures stood stark against the backdrop of an endless sky. Ruthie took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and something wild, like sage. Her hand instinctively went to her bodice, feeling the crisp fold of the fraudulent bill and the softer paper of Elijah Kane's letter. This was it, the moment of truth. She joined the trickle of passengers disembarking onto the splintered wooden platform. The sun was hot on her bonnet, and the light was so bright it made her squint. Instantly, she felt the eyes on her. Men in dusty hats paused their conversations. Women, emerging from the mercantile, stopped to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unvarnished judgment. She was an anomaly, a spectacle. The mail-order bride had arrived. Her gaze swept the small crowd, searching for a face that matched the man in her mind. She saw a few grizzled prospectors, a young deputy with a nervous twitch to his mouth, and a large, imposing man in a fine coat standing on the saloon porch, his face a mask of cold appraisal. Beside him stood a wiry man with the hardened look of a railroad bull, but none of them looked like a man who kept chickens that laid blue eggs. Then she saw him. He was standing near the station master's office, slightly apart from the others. He was taller than she'd expected, and leaner, built of the kind of sinewy strength that comes from relentless work, not brute force. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with the lines etched around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He wore a simple, clean shirt and dungarees. His hat held in his hands, and half hidden behind his legs were two small children. The boy, with dark, serious eyes so like the man's, watched her with a guarded intensity. He stood stiffly, his small hands clenched. The girl, a tiny thing with a cloud of brown hair, peeked out shyly, her thumb finding its way to her mouth as she clutched a worn rag doll. This was them. This was the family she had traveled 2,000 miles for. For a moment, Elijah Kane's gaze met hers across the platform, and the world seemed to fall silent. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not just appraisal, but a deep, bone-weary hope that mirrored her own. It was a look that said he had as much, if not more, staked on this moment as she did. A man's entire future, the well-being of his children, rested on the woman stepping off this train. The suspicion she had harbored, the cold knot of fear around the counterfeit bill, began to loosen its grip. No swindler looked at a woman with that much vulnerability in his eyes. He started toward her then, the children trailing in his wake like small, hesitant shadows. The whispers of the townspeople seemed to grow louder, a rustle of speculation that followed him across the platform. Ruthie's own resolve hardened. She would not be cowed. She lifted her chin and stood her ground, her carpetbag a flimsy shield in front of her. He stopped a pace away, his shadow falling over her. He was close enough now that she could see the faint scar on his jaw, the tiredness in his shoulders. He looked down at his hat, then back up at her, his throat working for a moment before he spoke. His voice was low and steady, with a gravelly timbre that seemed to carry the dust of the plains in it. "Miss Caldwell," he asked. "Mr. Kane," she replied, her own voice little more than a whisper. He nodded, a small, formal gesture. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken questions and the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. Then, he did something that silenced every doubt in her heart. He extended his hand, It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, the nails clean but the skin permanently ingrained with the earth he worked. It was the hand of an honest man. "Welcome home," he said. The words, so simple, so plain, landed with the force of a revelation. Home. He didn't say, "Welcome to Wyoming," or "Glad you made it." He said the one word her soul had been crying out for her entire life. A tear she hadn't known she was holding pricked at the corner of her eye. The counterfeit bill, the whispers, the long, lonely journey, it all fell away. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and reassuring. It wasn't a lover's touch, but a partner's, a promise. In that single point of contact, a silent contract was forged, a pact made against the harshness of the land and the judgment of the world. The whispers on the platform changed in tone, from mere curiosity to something more tangible, more real. The mail-order bride and the widower had sealed their bargain. "This is Will," Elijah said, gently drawing the boy forward, "and Clara." Will stared at the ground by Ruthie's feet, refusing to meet her eyes. Clara offered a tiny, fleeting smile before burying her face in her father's leg. Ruthie's heart ached for them. She was an intruder, a stranger replacing a memory. She simply nodded, offering them a quiet smile she hoped conveyed kindness, not pity. As they turned to leave the platform, the town of Red Rock came into sharper focus. They passed a woman with flour on her apron and kind, intelligent eyes, who was wiping down the front window of a small eatery. She gave Elijah a warm, encouraging nod. "May?" He greeted her quietly. "Elijah," she replied, her gaze lingering on Ruthie with a look of shrewd sympathy. "Safe travels home." The deputy she'd noticed earlier, Finch, tipped his hat. "Mr. Kane, ma'am," but his eyes darted nervously toward the saloon, where the large, well-dressed man was now watching their progress with an unnerving stillness. As they drew level with the saloon, the man stepped forward, blocking their path. He was handsome in a cruel way, his face florid, his eyes the color of pale ice. "Kane," he said, his voice a low drawl that oozed condescension. "Didn't figure you for the mail-order type. Then again, I suppose a man in your position needs a helping hand." His eyes raked over Ruthie, making her feel like a piece of livestock he was pricing. "Move aside." "Sloan?" Elijah said, his voice dropping to a low growl. His hand tightened instinctively on Ruthie's, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed. Barrett Sloan let out a soft chuckle. "Just being neighborly. Times are tough. The wells are running low. A man needs to be a shrewd calculator to make it out here. Your mortgage payment is due soon. I recall. I trust you've been resourceful." The word hung in the air, laced with insinuation. Ruthie felt a chill run down her spine. This was the man from the train station conversation, the one who wanted Elijah's land. As Sloan spoke, the wiry man beside him, Hobbs, pulled out a small notepad and a bottle of ink to make a note. He pressed a stamp onto the page, leaving a distinct mark of vivid purple ink. Ruthie's eyes widened slightly. It was the same shade, the same character, as a faint smudge she'd noticed on the corner of the counterfeit bill. The connection was tenuous, a flicker of a thought, but it lodged itself in her mind. Elijah said nothing, simply maneuvering them around Sloan and continuing down the dusty street. The confrontation was over in seconds, but it left the air charged with menace. The cane wagon was old but well-maintained. As Elijah lifted her carpetbag into the back, Ruthie saw a set of old, worn leather reins hanging from a hook on the driver's seat. They were intricately braided, the work of patient, skilled hands, and softened with age and use. They were clearly not the reins currently attached to the horses. She knew, with a certainty that made her throat tighten, that they had belonged to Mary, his first wife, a relic, a memory he kept close. The ride to the ranch was quiet. The clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels were the only sounds, save for the constant sigh of the wind across the plains. Clara fell asleep in the back, her head pillowed on a sack of flour. Will sat beside his father, stiff and silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon, pointedly ignoring Ruthie. The ranch, when they arrived, was much like the man himself, spare, weathered, but standing firm against the elements. A small, sturdy house, a solid-looking barn, and a web of fences enclosing a modest herd of cattle. It was all clean and orderly, but there was an air of exhaustion about the place, as if one man's two hands were barely enough to hold it all together. Inside, the house was scrubbed clean, but sparsely furnished. The main room served as a kitchen, dining room, and parlor all in one. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. It was a man's home, a widower's home. It was functional, but it lacked a woman's touch, the very thing she had been brought here to provide. Elijah showed her to a small room at the back. "This will be yours," he said, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "The children, it will take them time." It was both an apology and a plea for patience. "I understand," she said softly. He nodded, relieved, and retreated. Leaving her alone, the room was tiny, with just a bed, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the endless rolling grasslands. It was more than she had ever had to call her own. She placed her carpet bag on the bed and began to unpack her few belongings, 2 spare dresses, a Bible, her mother's silver locket. At the bottom, she pulled out the counterfeit bill. In the quiet of the room, she studied it again, her mind replaying the scene at the saloon. Sloane's taunting words about being resourceful, the flash of that purple ink stamp in Hobbs's hand. It was too much to be a coincidence. Someone wanted Elijah Kane to look like a cheat. Someone wanted to humiliate him, to destabilize him, to make him vulnerable. And that someone, she was now almost certain, was Barrett Sloane. She carefully folded the bill and hid it at the very bottom of the chest, beneath her spare linens. It was a dangerous secret, but it was hers to keep for now. She wouldn't accuse her new husband of fraud, not when he had welcomed her home with such simple, profound dignity, but she wouldn't ignore the threat either. She hadn't come all this way just to watch their chance at a life be stolen by a rich man's greed. A soft scratching sound at the door made her turn. Clara stood there, holding her rag doll. She didn't say a word, just looked at Ruthie with wide, curious eyes. Then she solemnly held out the doll. Tied around its neck was a small, faded blue ribbon, with fumbling little fingers. Clara untied it. She took a hesitant step into the room and placed the small scrap of ribbon on the corner of the bed. Then, just as quickly, she turned and scurried away. Ruthie stared at the ribbon, a tiny speck of color in the Spartan room. It wasn't much. It was just a faded piece of cloth from a child's toy. But it was an offering, a first tentative thread of connection, a welcome. Picking it up, her fingers closing around the soft, worn fabric. Ruthie looked out the window at the setting sun. The work would be hard. The children's hearts were wounded. A powerful enemy was circling. But for the first time in her life, standing in a small, plain room in the middle of nowhere, Ruthie Caldwell felt the undeniable, terrifying, and wondrous sensation of having arrived. She was home, and she would fight for it. Life on the Kane Ranch was a language spoken not with words, but with the body. It was in the ache of muscles at dawn and the deeper ache at dusk. It was in the rhythm of an axe splitting wood, the scrape of a hoe against hard-packed earth, and the low, patient call to cattle. For Ruthie, a woman whose hands were shaped by the repetitive clatter of a loom, it was a vocabulary she had to learn from scratch. The days began before the sun, in the cool, gray light that promised another scorching day. The first thing she did was build up the fire in the hearth, the glowing embers a fragile heart in the center of the quiet house. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee became the smell of her new life. Elijah would already be outside, his movements economical and sure as he milked their one cow and fed the horses. He was a quiet teacher, showing her how to knead bread with the right pressure, how to churn butter until it was firm, how to pluck a chicken with swift, clean motions. He never corrected her with sharp words, only a gentle hand guiding hers. "Watch," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "Like this." Her first test was mending a saddle. Not the worn braided reins of his late wife, those remained untouched, hanging like a sacred object in the wagon, but a piece of tack whose stitching had come loose. The leather was thick and unyielding, a world away from the soft threads of the mill. Elijah showed her how to use the awl and waxed thread, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly deft. As she worked, her own fingers clumsy and slow, she was acutely aware that this was a task Mary must have performed 100 times. The thought was a familiar pang of inadequacy. Was she just filling a space, a pair of hands to do the work a dead woman could no longer do? She felt like an imposter, stitching herself into a life that wasn't hers, yet, as the seam grew stronger under her patient work, a small, unfamiliar flicker of pride took root. She was learning. She was contributing. The children remained a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Clara would orbit her, a curious, silent moon, sometimes leaving small treasures for her to find: a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, and once, a pale blue egg from the Araucana hens, cradled carefully in a bed of grass. She accepted these gifts with the solemnity they were offered, and in the evenings, she would read to the little girl from a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales. Clara would sit close, not touching but within the circle of her warmth, until her breathing grew deep and she'd fall asleep, her head nodding against the rough fabric of Ruthie's dress. Will was a fortress. He spoke to her only when necessary, his answers clipped and grudging. He watched her with his father's serious eyes, but in them, she saw not hope, but a fierce, protective loyalty to the mother he remembered. He seemed to see Ruthie's every action as an attempt to erase his mother's memory. He worked alongside his father, his small body mimicking Elijah's movements, a 6-year-old man in training. One afternoon, he was trying to fix a loose board on the chicken coop, hammering a nail with intense concentration. His frustration grew with each crooked blow until, with a final, angry swing, the hammer missed and glanced off his other hand. He didn't cry out, but his sharp intake of breath was louder than any scream. He stood there, staring at his rapidly swelling knuckles, his face pale, tears of pain and fury welling in his eyes. Elijah was in the far pasture. Ruthie dropped the laundry she was mending and hurried over. "Will, let me see," she said, her voice calm. "It's fine," he muttered, trying to hide his hand behind his back. "It's not fine. You'll lose the nail if we don't tend to it." She spoke with the no-nonsense authority of the factory floor, a tone he seemed to understand better than soft coddling. He hesitated, then reluctantly held out his hand. She led him inside, cleaned the wound with carbolic soap and water, and wrapped it tightly with a clean strip of linen. Her hands, though unaccustomed to ranch work, were steady and sure. He watched her the entire time, silent and assessing. When she was done, he flexed his fingers carefully. "Thanks," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the neat white bandage. It was the first word he had offered her that wasn't a direct answer to a question. It was a tiny crack in the wall of his grief. The land itself was a constant, unforgiving presence. The late summer heat had baked the ground to the hardness of brick, and the water level in the well dropped a little more each day. At night, they could sometimes hear the yipping of coyotes or the deeper, more unsettling howl of a lone wolf, a reminder of the thin, man-made line of the fence that separated their small, orderly world from the vast wilderness. Their greatest challenge came in the form of a sky that turned the color of a bruise one afternoon. Elijah, scanning the horizon, went rigid. "Storm coming," he said, his voice tight. and a heifer's missing. She was due to calve any day. A frantic search began. Elijah rode out, his body a straight line of urgency on horseback, while Ruthie climbed the small rise behind the house, her skirts whipping in the rising wind. To scan the rolling plains, the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange green light. The cattle were lowing nervously in the corral, just as the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall. She saw a flash of brown huddled in a small, rocky draw a half-mile away. She shouted, her voice nearly stolen by the wind, and pointed. Elijah saw her signal and wheeled his horse around, galloping toward the spot. Ruthie ran back to the barn, her heart pounding. She lit a lantern and spread fresh hay in an empty stall, her mind racing with what might be needed. Minutes later, Elijah appeared at the barn door, the rain now coming down in sheets. He was carrying the newborn calf, its spindly legs dangling, and the mother cow was trotting anxiously behind him. The storm broke with a terrifying fury. Hail, the size of marbles, hammered against the barn roof like 1,000 angry fists. Inside, it was a small pocket of warmth and focused calm. The calf was weak, shivering, under Elijah's quiet instruction. Ruthie rubbed the small creature down with the rough burlap sacks, stimulating its circulation. While he tended to the mother, they worked together in the flickering lantern light, their movements synchronized, communicating with nods and gestures in that small, storm-battered space, surrounded by the smell of wet hay, rain, and new life. Ruthie felt a profound sense of partnership. They were a team, holding back the chaos of the natural world. When the calf finally staggered to its feet and began to nurse, a shared, unspoken sigh of relief passed between them. They stood side by side, watching the small miracle, their shoulders almost touching. Elijah looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. "You did good, Ruthie," he said. The simple praise warmed her more than the fire in the hearth ever could. But the world beyond the fence line always found a way to intrude. On a trip to Red Rock for supplies, they encountered Barrett Sloan. He was leaning against a post outside the mercantile, looking as if he owned the town. "Kane," he called out, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Heard you had a hailstorm out your way. Hope you didn't lose too much." "We managed," Elijah said, his tone clipped. Sloan pushed himself off the post and sauntered closer. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "That bank in Cheyenne, they don't understand the land. They just see numbers. I, on the other hand, am a neighbor." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "I'd be willing to buy your note from them. Take that mortgage off your hands. We can come to a more flexible arrangement." "My arrangement with the bank is fine," Elijah said, his jaw tightening. "Is it?" Sloan's eyes glinted. "Because what I hear is you're stretched thin. All I'd ask in return is that you cede the title to that northern strip of your pasture, the one that runs along the rail spur. It's no good for grazing anyway, but it would be useful to me. Think of it, Kane, no more debt hanging over your head." The offer was a silken trap. He wanted the land, the very piece that made Sloan's vast holdings contiguous. He was offering to be Elijah's savior and his executioner in the same breath. "My land's not for sale, Sloan," Elijah said, his voice flat and final. He turned his back and walked away, leaving Sloan with a cold smile still fixed on his face. The encounter left a shadow over the rest of the day. That evening, back at the ranch, Elijah was unusually quiet and withdrawn. After the children were asleep, he sat at the table with a small tin box that held his important papers. He laid out the banknote, the deed to the ranch, and the mortgage agreement, staring at them as if trying to divine the future from the ink. Ruthie sat nearby, mending one of Will's shirts. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the chirp of crickets outside. She watched him, saw the worry carve new lines into his face. He was a proud man, a man who carried his burdens alone. But she was his wife now, his partner. His burdens were hers, too. He was looking at the loan receipt from his last payment, his brow furrowed. He pushed it across the table in frustration. "It doesn't add up," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Ruthie picked it up. It was a standard receipt, detailing the amount paid and the remaining balance. But as her eyes scanned the paper, her breath caught in her throat. There, just beside the bank clerk's signature, was a small, greasy yet unmistakable thumbprint. It was a perfect whirl of lines, stamped in vivid purple ink. The world seemed to slow down. She saw with perfect clarity the scene outside the saloon on her first day. She saw Hobbs, Sloane's man, with his ink bottle and stamp. She saw the flash of purple as he marked his notepad. And she remembered the faint, identical smudge on the corner of the counterfeit $20 bill hidden at the bottom of her chest of drawers. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a signature, a sign of tampering. Someone hadn't just tried to frame Elijah as a cheat to her. They were altering the very documents that held his life, his home, his children's future. They were changing the numbers, manufacturing a debt that wasn't real, tightening a noose he couldn't even see. A cold, clear anger washed over her, replacing all her fear and self-doubt. She looked at Elijah, his head in his hands, a good man being slowly, methodically crushed by a power he couldn't fight because he didn't know its true nature. She said nothing. She simply folded the receipt and handed it back to him, her expression carefully neutral. To speak now, to reveal her suspicions without more proof, would only sound like a hysterical accusation from a mail-order bride he barely knew. It might push him to a reckless confrontation with Sloane. No, this was a fight that couldn't be won with fists or pride. It had to be won with wits. She had come west seeking a home, but she understood now that a home wasn't just a place you were given. It was a place you had to defend. And as she looked at the bowed head of the man who had welcomed her, she made a silent vow. She would be his eyes. She would uncover the truth. She would not let them take this life from him, from them. The investigation would be her secret, a quiet, dangerous act of love. The knowledge of the purple ink was a secret Ruthie carried like a hot coal in her pocket. It changed the way she saw everything, the rhythmic creak of the porch swing, the lowing of the cattle at dusk, the simple act of drawing water from the ever-lowering well. All of it was now overlaid with a sense of precariousness. The drying creek bed that snaked through their pasture became a stark metaphor for their own dwindling time. She watched Elijah, saw the tension in his shoulders as he mended the fences Sloane had called an impediment, and her heart ached with a protective anger that was entirely new to her. She knew she needed more than a suspicion. She needed certainty. An opportunity came a week later. On a supply run to Red Rock, Elijah was negotiating with the blacksmith over the price of a new plowshare, leaving Ruthie to purchase flour and salt from the mercantile. Next to the mercantile was May Hollis's eatery, its windows clean and its door propped open to catch the faint breeze. May was inside, wiping down her counter, and she gave Ruthie a warm smile of welcome. "It's a hot one, dear," May said, gesturing to a stool. "Sit a moment. I'll get you a glass of water." As Ruthie sat, grateful for the respite, her gaze drifted to the saloon across the street. The swinging doors offered a clear view of the interior, and standing at the bar was Hobbs, Sloane's wiry henchman. He was in deep conversation with the bartender. As she watched, Hobbs slapped a $50 bill on the bar, more money than Ruthie had seen at one time in her life. The bartender nodded, swept the bill into his cash box, and began counting out a thick stack of smaller bills, 5s and 10s. Before he pushed the stack toward Hobbs, he took out a small ink pad and a wooden stamp. With methodical motions, he pressed the purple stamp onto the corner of every single bill. Ruthie's blood ran cold. It was the system. This was how Sloane's dirty money was laundered, broken down, and put into circulation. each piece marked with his invisible, corrupting brand. Hobbs scooped up the money, stuffed it into his pockets, and swaggered out, leaving no doubt in Ruthie's mind. The counterfeit bill in her travel chest wasn't a random piece of bad luck. It was a weapon, deliberately sent to her, intended to poison Elijah's character from the very start. She must have made a sound, because May turned from the counter, her brow furrowed with concern. "You all right, Ruthie? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ruthie forced a smile. "Just the heat. May, thank you for the water." But as she left the eatery, the dust of the street felt less solid, as if the whole town were built on a foundation of lies. The next blow fell 2 days later. Deputy Finch rode out to the ranch, his horse kicking up a cloud of red dust. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes shifting everywhere but at Elijah. "Elijah," he started, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. I thought you should know. Word came down the wire this morning." He took a deep breath. "Barrett Sloan finalized the purchase of your mortgage note from the bank in Cheyenne. He's your creditor now." Elijah went unnaturally still. It was as if the news had turned him to stone. He had been bracing for a fight, but he had expected it to be with a distant, faceless bank, governed by rules and procedures. Now, the fight was with the wolf at his door. Sloan held the paper that gave him the legal right to devour them whole. "He can call the note due any time he wants," Finch added, his voice barely a whisper. "With cause. You miss a payment, you lose a head of cattle. Anything he can construe as a breach of terms." "I'm sorry, Elijah. I just figured you deserved to know who you were dealing with." "I always knew who I was dealing with," Elijah said, his voice dangerously quiet. The deputy nodded, looking miserable, and rode away without another word. That night, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Elijah barely ate, his thoughts clearly a world away. Ruthie wanted to reach out, to tell him what she knew, but the moment never seemed right. He had walled himself off, retreating into that stoic, masculine silence she was beginning to understand was his armor against a world that was relentlessly hostile. The attack came after midnight. It wasn't the howl of a wolf that woke them, but a different sound, the frantic, panicked bellowing of cattle. Elijah was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing the rifle he kept by the door. "Stay inside," he commanded Ruthie, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. "And keep the children away from the windows." He was gone before she could argue. Peeking through a crack in the curtains, she saw a scene of chaos. The herd, normally docile in the night pasture, was scattered. Dark shapes were moving wildly, crashing against the fences. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of a rider, a single figure driving the cattle further into the open plains. Elijah fired a shot into the air, a booming report that echoed across the valley. The distant rider immediately wheeled his horse and disappeared into the darkness, but the damage was done. It took them the rest of the night and most of the next morning to round up the herd. They found the source of the stampede easily enough, a long section of barbed wire fence near the northern edge of the property. The part bordering the railroad spur had been cut clean through with wire snips. Elijah stood over the severed fence, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His face was a thundercloud of helpless rage. This was a deliberate, calculated act of aggression. A clear message from Sloan. "I can touch you whenever I want. I can destroy what is yours." Back at the house, exhaustion and anger radiated from him in palpable waves. He paced the main room like a caged animal. Ruthie brought him a cup of coffee, her own hands trembling slightly. "We lost 3 head, he said, not looking at her. "One broke a leg in a gully. Had to put her down. The other 2 are just gone. Likely driven onto Sloan's land by now." "It was Sloan's man, wasn't it?" she asked softly. "Of course it was," he snapped, his voice rough with frustration. "Proving it's another matter. This is how he works. He pushes and prods and breaks a man down until he has no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar." He slammed his fist on the table. making the tin cups jump. "I'll handle this." "How?" "Elijah," she pressed, her patience fraying. "How will you handle it by riding into town and getting yourself into a fight you can't win?" "This is my fight. Ruthie, my land, my family." "You don't need to get your hands dirty with this." His words were meant to protect her, but they landed like a dismissal. He was shutting her out, relegating her to the role of a helpless woman who needed to be shielded from the ugliness of the world, the same world she had been navigating on her own for a decade. Something inside her broke. The fear, the deference, the quiet striving to earn her place, it all fell away. Replaced by a steel resolve, she stepped in front of him, blocking his path, forcing him to look at her. "Your family," she said, her voice low but shaking with intensity. "Am I not part of that family? Is this not my home? I didn't travel 2,000 miles to be a housekeeper. Elijah, I came here to be a partner. I didn't come here to stand by and watch our home be taken away." He stared at her, stunned into silence by her vehemence. He saw not a timid mail-order bride, but a woman as fierce and unyielding as the land itself. "You don't understand," he said, his voice softening slightly. "Then make me understand," she shot back. "Stop hiding behind your pride and talk to me." She took a deep breath, the moment of truth upon her. "This started before I even arrived. It started with this." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the folded, counterfeit $20 bill she had retrieved from her room that morning. She unfolded it and laid it flat on the table between them. Elijah stared at it, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this?" "It's the money you sent me for my expenses," she said. "The train steward told me it was a fake. I thought you had cheated me. I almost turned back." His face paled, a mixture of shock and hurt in his eyes. "Ruthie, I swear to you." "I know," she said, cutting him off gently. "I know you didn't know, but someone else did." She then told him everything about the purple ink smudge on the corner of the bill, about the identical thumbprint on his loan receipt, about watching Hobbs and the bartender at the saloon, stamping a whole stack of bills with the same purple ink. As she spoke, she saw the pieces click into place in his mind, the random acts of hostility, the veiled threats, the manipulated paperwork. It wasn't just a land grab anymore. It was a conspiracy, a systematic campaign to ruin him. He sank onto a chair, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a heavy weariness. "He's been bleeding me dry on paper for months," he said, his voice hollow, "making it look like I'm falling behind when I'm not." The weight of it all seemed to finally crush his stoic reserve. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw past the pride and the quiet strength to the raw fear beneath. "He's going to take it all, Ruthie," he whispered, and the sound was more devastating than any shout. "This land, it's all I have. It's all I have to give my children. Mary is buried on that hill up there. This is their home. If I lose this land, I lose everything. I lose their home." The confession, so simple and so raw, broke down the last wall between them. This wasn't about land or cattle or money. It was about a father's terror of failing his children, of losing the one piece of solid ground he could offer them in a treacherous world. Ruthie's anger softened into a deep, powerful empathy. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm, steady. "No," she said, her voice clear and certain. "He won't, because he's not just fighting you anymore. Elijah, he's fighting us." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and he covered her hand with his own. In that moment, a new partnership was forged, not with a handshake on a public platform, but in the quiet of their kitchen, cemented by a shared secret and a common enemy. The fight wasn't over. It had just truly begun. The uneasy truce that had settled over the ranch was as thin and brittle as a pane of ice in late winter. They knew Sloan would retaliate. The only questions were how and when. The answer came 3 nights later, carried on the back of a hot, dry wind blowing in from the west, a wind that sucked the moisture from the land and made the cured grasses of the plains whisper like dry bones. It was the smell that woke Ruthie first, a sharp, acrid scent of smoke where there should only be the clean, sage-scented air of the high desert night. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. In the main room, a floorboard creaked. Elijah was already awake. She threw on a robe and hurried out to find him standing at the open doorway, a dark silhouette against a hellish orange glow on the horizon. The glow was coming from the far side of their northern pasture. "He's running the cattle again," Elijah said, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "Using fire this time." It was a classic, cruel tactic: set a grass fire upwind and let the smoke and flames panic the herd, driving them through the broken fences and onto Sloane's land, where they would be impossible to retrieve. But as they watched, the wind, which had been a steady westerly breath all day, began to shift. It swirled, gusted, and then, with a malevolent moan, it turned. The hot, dry wind began blowing directly from the north, directly toward them. The orange glow on the horizon seemed to leap forward, swelling in size. It was no longer a distant threat to their cattle. It was a hungry beast racing across the dry grass, aimed squarely at the heart of the ranch, at the hay barn. "The barn," Elijah whispered, the words filled with a dawning horror. The barn was their future. It held the winter feed, the tools, the wagon, everything. If they lost the barn, they lost the ranch. There was no more time for thought. Action was the only prayer they had left. "Ruthie, get the children," he yelled, already sprinting toward the well. "Wet down the house, the walls, the roof. As much as you can. I'll try to dig a fire break." Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded Ruthie's veins. She flew to the children's room. Will was already awake, his eyes wide with fear as he stared at the flickering light outside his window. Clara was still asleep, a small, peaceful lump under a quilt. "Will, I need your help," Ruthie said, her voice steady and firm, betraying none of the terror she felt. "Wake your sister. Get dressed. Both of you. We have to carry water." The boy didn't argue. He saw the truth of the situation in her face and nodded, his small face set with a grim maturity far beyond his years. While he roused a whimpering, sleepy Clara, Ruthie grabbed every bucket, pot, and basin she could find. The next hour was a blur of frantic, desperate labor. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. Embers, like malevolent fireflies, began to drift down from the sky, landing on the dry wood of the house and the tinder-dry thatch of the barn roof. The roar of the approaching fire was a constant, deafening beast. Elijah worked with a savage intensity, his shovel a blur as he dug a wide and shallow trench in the earth between the pasture and the barn. The ground, baked hard by the summer sun, fought him for every inch. Ruthie and the children formed a desperate brigade from the well to the house. Will, his face streaked with soot, worked with a silent, furious energy, hauling buckets half full of water that slopped over his boots. Even little Clara, her face pale with fear, did her part, dipping rags into a basin and handing them to Ruthie to slap against the walls where embers landed. A neighbor, Jed Miller, a homesteader from a mile down the creek who had his own reasons to despise Sloane, saw the glow and came riding hard, arriving with 2 more shovels and a grim determination. The heat became a physical blow. Their skin grew tight and raw, their throats parched. The world shrank to the next bucket of water, the next shovelful of dirt, the next ember to be stamped out. They were a tiny, defiant island of humanity against a tidal wave of flame. As the fire drew closer, its front a 20-foot-high wall of roaring orange, Ruthie saw a figure near the fence line, momentarily illuminated against the flames. It was a man on foot, watching them fail. Hobbs. He was there to witness his handiwork. Elijah saw him too. A guttural roar of pure rage ripped from his throat. He dropped his shovel and charged toward the fence. Hobbs, startled, turned to run, but Elijah was faster. Fueled by adrenaline and a father's protective fury, he vaulted the fence and tackled Hobbs to the ground. It was not a clean fight. It was a desperate, clumsy scuffle between two exhausted men in the smoke and chaos. Fists flew, connecting with sickening thuds. They rolled on the ground, kicking and grappling. Ruthie screamed Elijah's name, but her voice was lost in the roar of the fire. She saw them break apart, saw Elijah stumble to his feet. As Hobbs scrambled up, he grabbed a rock from the ground and swung it wildly, catching Elijah on the side of the head. Elijah staggered back, a dark gash opening on his forehead. He swayed on his feet, but his resolve held. He lunged forward one last time, landing a solid punch that sent Hobbs sprawling. The man lay there for a second, stunned, then scrambled to his feet and fled into the darkness, leaving Elijah standing alone, panting, with blood streaming down his face. Ruthie ran to him. "Elijah!" He swayed, putting a hand to his head. "I'm all right," he grunted, but his eyes were unfocused. "The fire." "Jed is here. We have to keep going," she urged, her mind racing. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her petticoat, poured some of the precious water on it to clean the wound as best she could, then pressed the clean side firmly against the gash. "Hold this here, tight. We can't lose the barn." That focus, that shared purpose, seemed to clear his head. He nodded, his jaw set, and together they stumbled back to the fight. He picked up his shovel, she her bucket, and they rejoined Jed and the children in the desperate, final stand. They held the line. The fire licked at the edges of the firebreak, spitting and hissing, but the raw earth held it back. They beat back the flames that leaped the trench with wet sacks and shovels, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. The fire, denied its primary target, raged past them on either side, consuming the pasture but leaving the small sanctuary of the house and barn untouched. As the eastern sky began to pale from black to a bruised purple, the fire began to die down. Having consumed all the fuel in its path, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the hiss and crackle of smoldering grass and the ragged sound of their own breathing. They stood in the yard, four soot-blackened, smoke-stained figures in a landscape of ash. The barn was safe. The house was safe. But the world around them was a blackened, smoking ruin. Will and Clara had huddled together and fallen into an exhausted sleep on the porch steps. Jed Miller, after a shared look of grim understanding with Elijah, nodded once and rode off into the smoky dawn. Ruthie and Elijah were left alone, standing in the middle of the devastation. He was swaying slightly, his face pale beneath the grime. The makeshift bandage on his head was soaked through with blood. She gently took his arm to steady him. He looked at the saved barn, then at the house where his children slept. He turned his gaze to her, and his eyes, hollowed with exhaustion, were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. He slowly reached out and took her hand. His was covered in blisters and soot, but his grip was solid, an anchor in the smoldering world. "Welcome home," he whispered, his voice hoarse and cracked. This time, the words were not a greeting. They were not a formality. They were a testament, a recognition, a vow. He wasn't welcoming her to a place he owned. He was acknowledging that this ruin and this victory, this ash and this survival, was theirs. The home had been forged in the fire, and she was as much a part of its foundation as he was. Tears she didn't know she had left streamed down Ruthie's face, carving clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. She stepped forward, into the circle of his arms, and he held her. They clung to each other. Two people pushed to the absolute limit, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. It was not an embrace of passion, but of profound, bone-deep relief and gratitude. He smelled of sweat, smoke, and earth. He smelled like survival. He drew back just enough to look at her, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw. And then, amidst the ruins of the night, surrounded by the smell of burnt grass and damp ashes, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a short, chaste kiss, tasting of soot and desperation and a promise for the dawn. It was the truest kiss she had ever known. A shout from the lane broke the spell. Deputy Finch was riding toward them, his face a mask of shock as he took in the blackened landscape. Behind him, on the main road, a few wagons had stopped, the townspeople staring in silence at the devastation. The fire had been visible for miles. Finch dismounted, his eyes going from the cut fence line to the gash on Elijah's head. "Elijah, what in God's name happened here?" Before Elijah could answer, Ruthie spoke, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the quiet morning air. "Ask Barrett Sloane's man, Hobbs. He was here. He set the fire. And he did this to my husband." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. The whispers and rumors that had followed the mail-order bride were silenced, replaced by a new narrative. This woman was no helpless victim. She had fought for her home. She was a survivor. Finch looked from Ruthie's defiant face to Elijah's bloodied one, then to the undeniable evidence of the cut fence and the arson. He looked at the watching eyes of the townspeople. For once in his life, the path of least resistance was also the path of duty. He was a weak man, but he wasn't a blind one. He squared his narrow shoulders. "I'll ride out and find him," he said, a new authority in his voice. "He'll be held for questioning. You have my word." As the deputy mounted and rode off, a grim purpose on his face, Elijah kept his hand firmly in Ruthie's. The battle of the night was over, but they both knew the war for their home had just been declared. The day after the fire, the ranch was a strange mix of ruin and sanctuary. The smell of burnt wool from their own smoke-damaged clothes mingled with the sharp scent of ash that coated every surface. But inside the house, a quiet, determined order was taking hold. The fire had burned away more than just grass. It had incinerated the last of the distance between them, welding them into a single, unified whole. Dr. Avery came out that afternoon, ostensibly to check on Elijah's head wound, but really to bear witness. He was a small, bird-like man with eyes that missed nothing. While he cleaned and stitched the gash on Elijah's forehead with the neat, precise movements, his gaze took in the blackened fields and the determined set of Ruthie's jaw. Elijah, uncharacteristically, didn't protest the fuss. He sat at his own kitchen table and let another man tend to him, a sign of a subtle but seismic shift in his character. He was learning to accept help. "This will heal clean, Doctor," Avery said, tying off the last stitch. "But the cause of it is a sickness that's been festering in this town for a long time." He then turned to the loan receipt that Elijah had placed on the table. He took out a small magnifying glass and peered at the purple thumbprint. He sniffed it. "Interesting," he murmured. "This isn't standard bank ink. This is an aniline dye, common in accounting ledgers. It's formulated to be quick-drying and fade-resistant." He looked up, his sharp eyes meeting Ruthie's. "The only place in Red Rock that uses this specific mixture is the teller's counter at Sloane's Saloon. I've seen it 100 times on his men's pay stubs. It's his mark, as sure as his brand on a steer." The doctor's clinical confirmation was a cold, hard piece of steel they could build their case upon. It wasn't just a smudge anymore. It was evidence. That evening, May Hollis drove her buckboard out to the ranch. Her face, usually so cheerful, was etched with a grim resolve. She carried a small, leather-bound notebook as if it were a loaded pistol. "I found this," she said without preamble, placing it on the table. "Hobbs is a creature of habit. Every Friday, he gets drunk at the saloon and stumbles over to my place for coffee and pie to sober up before Sloane sees him. He must have dropped it last week. It was wedged behind the flour bin." The book was Hobbs's ledger, in a spidery, barely legible scrawl. It detailed months of sordid transactions. There were notes of payments for fence work, entries for spooking Kane's herd, and most damningly, a detailed accounting of large bills from Sloane being exchanged for smaller, marked bills from the saloon teller. It was a complete record of the conspiracy. He's not a smart man. Our Mr. Hobbs, May said, her lips a thin line. Just a mean one. This book, Dr. Avery's testimony, you have a chance. Elijah, the town council is meeting in 2 days to discuss the fire. You have to be there. And you, she said, turning to Ruthie, you have to speak. The idea of speaking before the entire town sent a flutter of the old fear through Ruthie. She was still the outsider, the woman who had come by mail, but she looked at Elijah, at the fresh stitches on his brow, and then at Will and Clara, who were watching from the doorway, their small faces mirroring the gravity of the adults. Her fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. The morning of the council meeting, a strange, quiet peace settled over the ranch. While Elijah hitched the wagon, Clara came running from the chicken coop, her face alight with wonder. She was carefully cradling something in her hands. It was a tiny, wet chick, struggling out of the last fragments of a pale blue shell. Look, she squealed with delight. The blue egg hatched. She held it up for Ruthie to see. The chick was mottled and weak, but its tiny heart beat a strong, rapid rhythm against Clara's palm. She looked at the shell, then at a tiny speck of blood on its edge from the hatching. Red blood and a blue shell, the little girl declared with 4-year-old solemnity. That's good luck. Ruthie's heart swelled. From this strange, foreign place, life and hope were emerging. Before they left, Elijah stopped her in the main room. He was holding a small, velvet-lined box. It was worn, its edges soft with age. This was my mother's, he said, his voice low and a little rough. And her mother's before that. He opened it. Inside, resting on the faded velvet, was a simple, unadorned silver ring, polished to a soft glow by the hands of generations. Mary. She had her own family ring. I kept this for... He trailed off, struggling for the words. It's not meant to replace anything. It's meant to start something new, a new line. He took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. It was not a grand romantic gesture, but a quiet, profound act of grafting her onto his family tree. It was the ultimate acceptance, a symbol that their partnership was now a permanent bond. The meeting was held in the town's small, stuffy schoolhouse. It felt like the entire population of Red Rock and the surrounding homesteads had crammed inside. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and nervous tension. The room was divided. On one side sat Sloane's men and the merchants who depended on his business, their faces closed and hostile. On the other were the small ranchers and homesteaders, men like Jed Miller, their faces weathered and watchful. Barrett Sloane himself sat in the front row, looking perfectly at ease, as if the proceedings were a mild amusement. Deputy Finch, looking pale and out of his depth, stood beside the council president. Hobbs, who had been released pending the hearing, sat beside Sloane, looking sullen and belligerent. When Ruthie's name was called, a murmur went through the crowd. She saw a few of the town's more prosperous women lean in to whisper to one another, their gazes filled with condescending pity for the poor widower and his mail-order wife. Ruthie ignored them. She walked to the front of the room, her back straight, the silver ring on her finger a cool, solid weight. She looked for her family. Elijah was standing against the back wall, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on hers, a silent pillar of support. And in the very first row, clutching each other's hands, sat Will and Clara. They weren't looking at the crowd or at Sloane. They were looking at her, their eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering pride. She told her story. Her voice, though quiet, was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. She spoke of the counterfeit bill, of the steward's refusal on the train. She spoke of the purple ink. She spoke of the night of the fire, of seeing Hobbs at the fence line, of the rock in his hand. She presented facts, not accusations. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness. When she finished, Barrett Sloane let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "It's a touching story," he said, addressing the council, a frightened woman from the city, unused to our rough ways. Her imagination, fueled by smoke and fear, has clearly run away with her. But then Dr. Avery was called. He calmly and methodically explained the chemical composition of the ink on the loan receipt and traced its exclusive origin to Sloane's saloon. Then May Hollis came forward and presented Hobbs's ledger. The council president read a few entries aloud, his voice growing graver with each damning phrase. A low, angry growl rumbled through the side of the room filled with homesteaders. All eyes turned to Hobbs. His face had gone from sullen to ashen. He looked at Sloane, expecting his powerful employer to protect him, to dismiss all this with a wave of his hand. But Sloane's face was a mask of cold fury. He gave Hobbs a look of pure contempt, a look that said, "You are a liability. You're on your own." That look broke him. The weak, bullying cruelty that had been his only strength crumbled, leaving only a pathetic, terrified man in its place. "He made me do it," Hobbs blurted out, pointing a shaking finger at Sloane. The room erupted. "He made me do all of it. The counterfeit bill, the forged receipts. He wanted the land. He told me to cut the fence, to set the fire. He said it would just scare them, that no one would get hurt." The confession, raw and desperate, hung in the shocked silence that followed. It was over. The web of lies, so carefully woven in the dark, had been torn apart in the clear light of day. Deputy Finch, galvanized into action by the undeniable truth, stepped forward. For the first time, he stood tall, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't known he possessed. "Barrett Sloane, you are under arrest for conspiracy, forgery, and arson." The war was not yet won, but the decisive battle had been. As Finch led a stunned and furious Sloane from the schoolhouse, Elijah made his way through the crowd to Ruthie's side. He didn't say a word. He just took her hand, the one wearing his mother's ring, and squeezed it. It was all he needed to say. Together, they went to their children, who ran to them, not just as a father and his new wife, but as a family, whole and unbroken, ready to face the dawn. Barrett Sloane was a man unaccustomed to defeat, and he did not wear it well. Released on a surety bond paid with the kind of money that made a mockery of justice, he was not a man to slink away in shame. He was a predator, and when wounded, a predator is at its most dangerous. The calm that had followed the town council meeting was the deceptive quiet at the eye of a hurricane. Everyone in Red Rock held their breath, waiting for the other side of the storm. It came on a cool, clear morning a week later. Elijah and Will were out on the northern pasture line, methodically replacing the fire-damaged fence posts. It was slow, hard work, but there was a deep satisfaction in it. Each new post, set firm and deep in the hard-baked earth, was an act of defiance, a declaration of permanence. Ruthie was watching from the porch, a basket of mending in her lap, while Clara tied and retied the faded blue ribbon from her doll onto the porch railing, her small face a mask of concentration. They appeared first as a dust cloud on the horizon, then resolved into a group of 5 riders. They were not a chaotic mob, but an organized, intimidating force. At their head, riding a magnificent black stallion, was Barrett Sloane. He had come not to plead or negotiate, but to conquer. Elijah saw them coming and straightened up, his hand resting on the handle of the heavy mallet he'd been using. Will instinctively moved to stand behind his father. Ruthie's hands stilled in her lap. She ushered a wide-eyed Clara inside the house, her voice a low, steady command. "Stay here. Do not come out." Sloane and his men reined in their horses just outside the newly set fence line. The clatter of hooves and jingle of harnesses, an alien sound in the quiet morning. "Kane," Sloane called out, his voice dripping with condescending authority. He dismounted and strode to the fence, his polished boots a stark contrast to the dusty ground. "A commendable effort," he said, gesturing to the new posts, "but ultimately, a waste of your time." He reached into the inner pocket of his fine coat and produced a folded document, presenting it with a flourish. "This is a deed of transfer, signed and sealed by the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Your debt has been defaulted upon, your property foreclosed. As the primary creditor, I have taken possession. This paper says the land is mine." He held it out. The paper was thick, official-looking, and at the bottom was a heavy wax seal, impressed with the intricate eagle of the Territorial Bank. Elijah's face became a mask of cold fury. All the restraint, all the patient faith in the slow grind of justice, evaporated in the face of this brazen, final insult. He dropped the mallet and started toward the fence, his body coiled like a spring, ready to launch himself at the man who had tried to burn his home and was now trying to steal it with a lie. "Elijah, no." Ruthie's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air. She was standing on the porch, no longer a watcher but a participant. She walked down the steps and across the yard to stand beside her husband, placing a restraining hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid, trembling with contained violence. "Let me handle this, Ruthie," he growled, his eyes never leaving Sloane's smug face. "We will handle this," she corrected him quietly, but with an unshakable firmness. "But not here, and not like this." She turned her clear, steady gaze on Sloane. The rancher's dismissive smile faltered slightly under the weight of her composure. He had expected hysterics from the woman, brute anger from the man. He had not expected this unified, unreadable calm. "That document is a forgery, Mr. Sloane, and you know it," Ruthie said, her voice even. "If you believe it to be legal, then you will have no objection to presenting it in a proper venue. We will meet you at the church. The town council is already assembled. The whole town can bear witness to your claim." She had thrown down a gauntlet he could not refuse without revealing his own fraud. To back down now, in front of his own men, would be an admission of guilt. His power was built on a foundation of public fear and perceived invincibility. He could not afford to look weak. A flicker of cold anger passed through his eyes. "As you wish, Mrs. Kane," he sneered, putting a mocking emphasis on her name. "I do so enjoy a public spectacle." He turned and remounted, leading his men back toward town. Elijah watched them go, the tension slowly draining from his body, replaced by a grudging admiration. Ruthie had not cooled his anger, but she had channeled it, turning it from a destructive force into a focused weapon. She had moved the battlefield from a place of violence to a place of truth. The church was even more crowded than it had been for the first hearing. Word had spread like wildfire. This was the final act. When the Kanes entered, a path cleared for them. They walked to the front and stood together as a family, Will and Clara now standing between them, their small hands clutching those of their parents. Sloane stood before the council, arrogant and composed. He presented the deed with a theatrical flourish. "The law is the law," he said, his voice resonating in the silent church. "The Kanes have failed to meet their obligations. The property is now legally mine." The council president, a hardware merchant who was deeply in Sloane's debt, examined the paper and the seal. He looked flustered. "It appears to be in order," he began, his voice weak. "It appears to be," Ruthie's voice cut through the room, "but it is not." She stepped forward and placed Hobbs's ledger on the table. "This is the record of your conspiracy," she said, her voice clear and strong. She then placed the doctored loan receipt beside it. "This is the proof of your forgery." She looked at Dr. Avery, who was sitting in the front pew. He stood and addressed the council. "As I testified previously, the ink on that receipt is unique to Mr. Sloane's saloon," the doctor said, "and the seal on this new document He came forward and examined it with his magnifying glass. He scraped a tiny fleck of the wax onto a piece of paper. This is not the bank's seal. The bank uses a high-resin beeswax compound. This is common candle wax, mixed with resin and pigment to approximate the color. A clever forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. A low, angry murmur swept through the congregation. The homesteaders were on their feet, their face dark with anger. Sloane's carefully constructed facade of legality had been shattered. He stared at Ruthie, his face a mask of disbelief that had curdled into pure hatred. He had underestimated her, and it had cost him everything. Elijah stepped forward then, placing a hand on Ruthie's shoulder. He looked not at Sloane, but at the faces of his neighbors, the people who had watched him struggle, who had whispered about his new wife, who had witnessed the fire. For a long time, he began, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. I thought a man had to stand on his own, that asking for help or accepting it was a sign of weakness. He paused, his gaze finding May Hollis. Then Dr. Avery, then Jed Miller. I was wrong. His eyes then moved to the woman standing beside him. I would have lost everything, he said, his voice breaking slightly. My home, my children's future. I was ready to fight with my fists, because it was the only way I knew. But my wife, Ruthie, she fought with the truth. She saved us. He turned to her, in front of the entire town, and the two words he spoke were heavier and more meaningful than any vow. Thank you. In that moment, a small figure moved. Will stepped forward. He had been whittling all week, a new, intense focus on his face. He held out his hand to Ruthie. In it was a small, crudely but carefully carved wooden knife, its handle smoothed by his own small hands. It's for the seed barrels, he said, his young voice clear and proud in the hushed church. For opening them, for next season. It was more than a gift. It was a transfer of trust, an acceptance into the deepest rituals of their family. It was a promise of a future, of seasons to come. Ruthie knelt and accepted the small knife as if it were a crown jewel, her eyes shining with tears. The emotional climax broke the spell of inaction. Deputy Finch, his face grim, stepped forward, a pair of handcuffs dangling from his hand. His voice, for the first time, held the full weight of the law. Barrett Sloane, I am rearresting you on the original charges and adding the charge of felony forgery of a legal document. Sloane didn't resist. His arrogance had finally crumbled, leaving behind a hollow, defeated man. As Finch led him away, no one cheered. There was no sense of gloating or vicious triumph. There was only a profound, solemn sense of justice. Long delayed, finally served. Later that week, the final pieces fell into place, with Sloane's assets frozen pending a territorial trial. A federal marshal confirmed the forgeries. The bank in Cheyenne, embarrassed and eager to avoid a scandal, readily agreed to restructure Elijah's legitimate debt on fair terms. Hobbs, in exchange for a lesser sentence, agreed to testify against his former employer. The reign of Barrett Sloane was over. That evening, as the sun began to set, the Kane family walked out to the new northern fence line. The posts were straight and true, the wire strung tight. It was more than a fence now. It was a monument to their survival. Clara, who had been clutching the faded blue ribbon all day, ran to the very first post, the one nearest their home. With great care, she tied the ribbon around it. The small scrap of blue cloth fluttered in the evening breeze. There, she said, patting the post with satisfaction. Now it's ours. Elijah put his arm around Ruthie's shoulders, and Will leaned against his father's side. They stood there together, a family forged in adversity, looking out over the land that was truly, finally, their home. The fence was no longer a barrier to keep the world out. It was a line they had drawn in the earth, a declaration of where their world began. Autumn did not arrive in Wyoming with the fiery blaze of New England's maples. It came as a slow, golden softening. The fierce white heat of summer bled from the sky, replaced by a deep, crystalline blue. The prairie grasses, scorched black in the fire, began to show the faintest blush of new green, a stubborn testament to the life that always persisted. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of drying earth and the distant promise of snow for the Kane family. It was their first season of peace. The shadow of Barrett Sloane had receded, his name now a cautionary tale whispered in the saloon, his vast holdings tied up in the slow, grinding gears of territorial law. The fear that had been a constant, unwelcome guest at their table was gone, and in its absence, a quiet joy began to take root and flourish. The symbol of this new season was the old apple tree that stood in a sheltered hollow behind the house. It was a gnarled, solitary thing, planted by the original homesteader decades ago, its trunk thick and its branches twisted as if by the memory of 1,000 winds. Most years. Elijah had confessed. He barely had the time to gather the fruit. But this year was different. This year was for harvesting. They made it a family affair. Elijah, with his long reach, carefully picked the apples from the highest branches, calling down to Will to move the ladder. Will, nimble and quick, scrambled through the lower limbs, his laughter echoing in the clear air as he dropped apples into the baskets Ruthie held steady below. Even Clara had her job, meticulously gathering the windfalls from the long grass, inspecting each one for bruises with the seriousness of a seasoned merchant. They spent a whole day stripping the tree, their hands growing sticky with sweet juice, their baskets overflowing. The next day, they brought out the old cider press from the back of the barn. It was a heavy, cast-iron contraption that took both Elijah and Ruthie to operate. He would load the pulped apples, and she would turn the great screw, her arms straining against the resistance until a steady, amber stream of cider flowed into the waiting buckets. Will and Clara took turns catching the drips on their tongues, their faces alight with a simple, uncomplicated delight. They worked together, a small, efficient team, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They filled dozens of jars with cider, lining them up on the shelves of the root cellar, a sweet, golden promise against the coming winter. The work was hard, but it was the work of building, not just surviving. It was the work of a home. In the quiet afternoons that followed, each member of the family began to carve out their own space within that home. Ruthie claimed the small, unused storage room at the back of the house, the one she had first slept in, with Elijah's help. She put up shelves and a sturdy table. She unpacked her sewing kit, the familiar needles and threads of her old life. But now they felt different. They were no longer tools of relentless factory labor, but instruments of creation. She mended the children's clothes, patched Elijah's work shirts, and began piecing together a quilt from scraps of old fabric. From her window, she had a clear view of the new, straight fence line and the vast, open prairie beyond. She was no longer looking out at a world that threatened her, but at a world that was hers. Will, in turn, found his purpose at the small workbench in the barn. The crude knife he had given Ruthie was just the beginning. Using scraps of leather and his father's tools, he began to make a saddle. It was a miniature, perfectly proportioned creation, sized not for a horse, but for Clara's worn rag doll. He worked with a fierce, quiet concentration, his tongue sticking out from the corner of his mouth as he painstakingly tooled the leather and stitched the seams. When he was finished, he presented it to his sister with a shy, gruff pride. Clara, in a rare display of open affection, threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. Clara herself seemed to be growing wilder and more confident with each passing day. She roamed the edges of the property, her pockets filled with river stones and strangely shaped twigs. One afternoon, she returned to the house, her eyes wide with a sacred awe. She opened her small, grubby hand to reveal her latest treasure. A single, magnificent feather, a barred wing feather from a golden eagle. It was a gift from the sky, from the wild heart of the land itself. "It's a strong charm," she whispered to Ruthie, her voice filled with conviction. She kept it in a small box beside her bed, a symbol of the untamed strength she was beginning to find within herself. The love between Ruthie and Elijah grew in the same way the ranch was healing quietly, steadily, without the need for grand declarations. It was in the way he started bringing her the first pale blue egg he found each morning. It was in the way she learned to anticipate when he'd want a hot cup of coffee, having it ready on the hearth when he came in from the cold. Their partnership, born of necessity and forged in fire, was now softening into a deep and abiding affection. One evening, after the children were sound asleep, they stood side by side at the dry sink in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp on the table, casting their long shadows against the log walls. The only sound was the gentle clink of pottery and the soft splash of water. Ruthie was washing, her hands moving deftly in the warm, soapy water. Elijah was drying, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile plates. As she reached for another dish, her hand brushed against his under the water. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. He didn't pull away. For a moment, their hands simply rested together in the water, a quiet, intimate acknowledgement. He broke the silence, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "We'll need to order the winter wheat seed from Cheyenne soon. Jed Miller said the price is fair this year." "I was looking at the seed catalog," she replied, her voice soft. "They have new varieties of beans that might do well in this soil." "Maybe," he mused. He finished drying a plate and stacked it carefully. "That little alcove by the fireplace, the one where I keep the old ledgers. It's wasted space." "I thought so, too," she said. "It would get the morning light. It would be a good place for a bookshelf, a place to read to the children when the snow comes." "A reading corner," he said, the idea taking root. He liked the sound of it. He looked at his son's worn-out boots by the door. "Will's growing so fast. He'll be needing a man's saddle before we know it." "And Clara will need a proper school," Ruthie added. "May was saying there's talk of hiring a real teacher for the town next year." They spoke of the future, of seeds and seasons, of books and boots, of the lives of their children stretching out before them. Their conversation was a quiet, steady act of weaving their lives together, thread by ordinary thread. Love wasn't in a passionate declaration. It was here, in the shared task, in the easy rhythm of their planning, in the simple, certain knowledge that they would face all those coming seasons, the harsh and the gentle, together. When the last dish was dried and put away, he reached out and gently touched the silver ring on her finger, his thumb tracing its smooth, worn surface. He didn't need to say anything. His touch said it all. Later, they stood on the porch, wrapped in quilts against the evening chill. The vast, star-dusted sky of Wyoming arched over them. A sliver of moon cast a pale, milky light on the landscape, turning the grasslands into a sea of silver and shadow. The blackened patches of the pasture were now just darker shades of gray, resting, waiting for spring. In the far distance, the twin steel lines of the railroad track caught the moonlight, a faint, harmless glimmer. It was no longer a symbol of an encroaching, hostile world, but simply a part of the landscape, a road that had brought her here. Ruthie leaned her head against Elijah's shoulder, fitting perfectly into the space that seemed made for her. She breathed in the cool, clean air, the scent of pine and wood smoke from their own chimney. She was no longer the frightened woman on the train, hurtling toward an unknown fate. She was here. She was rooted. She looked out at the quiet, sleeping land that she had fought for, at the sturdy house that she had helped save, and at the man standing solid and warm beside her. A profound sense of peace, deeper than any she had ever known, settled over her. "Welcome home," she whispered, the words spoken not to him, but to her own heart. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button